Amina sat on the red earth outside her father's compound while the rain, thin as harmattan breath, stitched the dust into wet clay around her ankles, and the iron gate thudded shut behind her. Father had just told the town that his daughter was no longer his, and if she stayed, she would lose the little plot of land that fed her mother and the school fees for her brother. One word, shame, strip a woman of home and promise in a single sentence, and who had whispered that word into her father's ear? A knock at the gate had been a gavel that afternoon, and someone in a suit had smiled like charity while his hands took the accounting book. Was there more than pride at stake, and could the truth be pried from the lips that had been paid to keep quiet? What secret power watched from the edges and would change everything? She wrapped the thin shawl tighter, feeling the sting of humiliation and a small, unnameable ember of resolve. Then a man from the village shouted, "She must go!" The gate slammed again, and Amina rose with a bundle and one question on her tongue: where does a daughter go when her father locks the door? Before the gate, Amina's life had been ordinary in the way of many daughters, and mornings in the market helping her mother weigh tomatoes and count change, afternoons studying to finish her teaching certificate, evenings under the generator's steady hum while her father read his newspapers and told stories about the old days. She loved the church courtyard where she learned to braid patience into prayer, and she loved the sound of danfo horns in Lagos because they promised the city strange kindness and danger in equal measure. She loved her father despite the brittle pride that lined his voice. When the headline of the town became "Father kicked out his daughter," Amina felt each familiar corner of her world tilt. She had always believed in dignity. Why and in paying debts to people before owing apologies to pride, and those values would now be sharpened against the city's edge as she prepared to leave the familiar red earth behind. The inciting incident was a small lie inflated into a verdict. At the mosque courtyard, a whispered rumor, she kept company with a man from the market, had been sewn into evidence by a warm-voiced woman named Auntie Taupe, who had laid a cool hand on Baba Musa's shoulder and offered help that tasted like sugar. Let her go and learn her lesson, Auntie Taupe had crooned, folding herself into the father's shame like someone tucking a child into a chair. And Baba Musa, who had debts and a pride that counted for more than sleep, had signed papers that sold a portion of their compound to a local investor without Amina's knowledge. The papers were the sound that split the family. She heard the scratch of pen and felt the land recede, and Amina, who had thought loyalty meant keeping home together, now had to choose between leaving quietly or fighting in a court that smelled of cigar smoke and men's impatience. She left with one satchel, one certificate, and the taste of betrayal in her mouth. The first trial was the city itself. Lagos met her with a chorus of horns and the sour oil of open kitchens, a crush of people with their own small emergencies, and a landlord who said, "You will pay for the month up front." Amina learned quickly that the city measured worth by bank balances, not by quiet courage. She sold the handful of things she had, slept on benches near the bus terminus, and took work at a small school where the pay was late and the headteacher's smile was a brittle coin. A pattern formed. Each small triumph stepped on a trap. The wages withheld 4 administrative delays, a promised transfer to a better class that never came, and a notice in the housing office that her temporary room would be given to someone with better connections. Her throat tightened when she called home and only heard the gate closing in the background. Each step forward seemed to press some colder hand into her back. How much could she carry before the city shook it loose? The second trial arrived in the shape of kindness disguised as kin. Auntie Taupe found Amina at the market one evening under generator light and said, "Come, child, stay with me. Lagos is hard for girls alone." Amina, remembering the warmth of a woman's hand on a fevered forehead, accepted the shelter. Inside Taupe's cluttered flat, the kettle sang and the television told stories of easier lives, and for a few nights Amina slept in a bed that smelled of sachet laundry soap and women's laughter. But kindness at Taupe's price revealed itself like a slow leak. Taupe lent Amina a job contact, which was really a front for a stall owner who skimmed wages and demanded fees for protection. Amina's promise of loyalty became a debt that fed Taupe's smile and fattened a man who wore a designer watch and a thin excuse. The betrayal cut because it wore the skin of help. What else did Taupe keep hidden behind her warmth? A pattern interrupt came with the smell of rain on tar and a new place, a busy street corner where a man in a plain cap was leaning on the hood of a dusty car, counting change from a throat surgery campaign. Amina, eyes rimmed from shortage and shame, dropped a little boy's satchel back into his arms when she found it. You did not have to, the man said with a voice like river stone, and she felt something settle in her chest when he smiled without judging. He offered her a cup of bread and tea and pressed a small card into her hand, nothing more than a name and a number, then disappeared into the churn of Danfo horns and market life. For the first time since the gate had slammed, a door opened less by authority than by quiet recognition. The man was not glamorous, but his calm had weight, and Amina tucked the card into her wallet like a prayer. What did he want, and why did she feel strangely seen? The third trial tightened like a loop, a false accusation at the market when a purse went missing and Tope's stall-owner friend pointed at Amina with the practiced certainty of someone who had already exchanged her for more than food. She took it, he cried, and the market's bustle folded into a catcall of accusation. Amina, who had returned the lost satchel only days before, found herself pinned beneath gossip and angry fingers. A policeman took statements in a courtyard where a mosque bell and a church bell met in a trembling silence, and Amina's certificate, the one thing that might prove she had been a teacher and not a thief, was nowhere because Tope had kept it safe. She felt her insides hollow out. Tope's daily cup of sugar and her warm smiles hardened into an apparatus for extortion, and Amina's only lever now was the thin strip of courage she had stitched through the city's sharp edges. The crowd leaned in. What would she give to prove what she knew, and who would? Believe the daughter the town had been told to reject. In the morning when the market sky looked too heavy to promise anything, Amina did a thing that felt small and large at once as she sat down in the shadow of the generator and shared her bread with a stray mutt who had a limp from a forgotten fight, coaxing it with the same gentle patience her mother had used on small children. A man in a plain cap watched from the corner, his eyes steady, and when the dog's tail remembered wagging he folded his hands and said, "Kindness keeps accounts that men cannot see." He later helped her return a wallet to a woman who had dropped it into a puddle, refusing even the small fee the woman offered. Amina, who believed that dignity was measured by what you returned to the world, felt the seed of kindness take root in a new soil. Unbeknownst to her, the plain-capped man, who had been listening to Tope's tales and watching the theft accusation like a judge, filed his own quieter report to someone higher up. The small things Amina did would not dissolve into the market air, and the witness would matter more than either of them could imagine. Would small mercies be enough to buy back her name? Pressure compressed in on her like the Lagos afternoon as rent notices multiplied and the school headteacher gave an ultimatum, 3 days to produce your ID and last month's wages, or we cannot keep you in the classroom. Amina felt the timeline press into her like heat. The boy who helped her through street lessons, thin-voiced and eager, could not be left without his mentor, and the housing clerks repeated by dawn echoed around her until she could taste it. Her brother's school called to ask for fees as if the compound were only a memory that could be paid in parts. Amina counted the days and the naira and the possibilities and found only 3 small harborings of hope, the plain man's card, a teacher's promise to hold her place for 72 hours, and the fragile resilience in her own spine. If she failed this tight test, the consequences were final: no classroom, no shelter, a name burned in the market and a father's silence as a verdict. The deadline tightened further as she faced the choice before dawn: steal to pay a fee and secure a roof for another week, or plead publicly to a court of neighborhood elders and risk deeper humiliation. A radio in a nearby Danfo bleated news of a company buying up estates and promises of progress, and Amina felt the city's private hands rearranging people's lives like chess pieces. Her mind kept drifting to the card from the plain man, to his observation about kindness keeping accounts, and she reasoned that her choice would say more about the life she wanted than any immediate comfort could buy. If she stole, she would be shored up by shame, and if she stood, the cost would be immediate but perhaps not total. She chose standing, and the dawn found her in a courtyard asking for the truth even as her throat trembled. At the aching midpoint of her story, the plain-capped man stepped into full light. He removed the worn cap and the plain jacket, and Amina saw a face she had seen only in glossy pages in the public library, a face on the front of a business profile, with the name Chief Abdul Adeyemi below it, and he smiled with a relief that made the crowd hush. "You returned a satchel and shared bread with a dog," he told the gathering as if reciting scripture, "and that is where I took my measure." Where Amina had expected only aid, the man revealed the truth in a way that shifted the earth. Chief Adeyemi was not only a philanthropist but the hidden billionaire, the owner of the company that had been buying plots near Baba Musa's compound, a man who had been watching the town from a boardroom and had recently learned of a pattern of coercion by a local investor and by Auntie Taupe, who had been selling small people's names into deals. The revelation reframed everything. Amina's small acts were now a lever in the hands of a man who could move mountains of paper, and she found herself at the crossroad of revenge and restoration. What would she use such hidden power for? The darkest moment did not come from money but from the conscience's sharpest edge. Baba Musa refused to see the billionaire's evidence and instead lashed out, his pride wounded deeper than the proofs could soothe. Hope, who had long kept her hands clean with honeyed words, produced a few crumpled receipts and a dozen neighbors who would lie under oath. The investor threatened to sue for libel and rallied men who owed him favors. Amina, offered a whisper of wealth and the choice to tear her father down in front of the town, felt the old ember kindle into heat. She could settle scores, buy the land, and see houses rebuilt with her name on the deeds, or she could insist on truth and dignity without humiliating her own father. From the seed of kindness she had sown at the generator with a dog's slow tail wagging, she chose dignity. I will not use this to humiliate him, she told Chief Adeyemi, feeling the decision like cool metal in her hand. I will use it to make sure the town knows what happened and to build a future where we do not sell our names to the highest bidder. The climax played out in the mosque courtyard and on the edge of the market where people stood like a sea of faces waiting for the tide to break. Chief Adeyemi presented contracts, bank transfers, and a ledger that showed how Auntie Taupe and the investor had arranged the sale of titles and promised funds that never reached Baba Musa. Here, he said, laying out the paper like daylight over the earth, are the signatures that took your land and the trails of money that paid for shame. The investor's smugness crumpled as men with uniforms arrived, and Taupe's smile froze while a neighbor who had been paid to stay silent finally swallowed and told the truth. Baba Musa, forced to confront the proof with his chest heaving and eyes wet like someone who had been pricked by his own conscience, could not summon the old arrogance. He crumpled into a chair, and the town felt the scales tip toward justice as whispers turned into a single clear breath. Amina watched, felt the old wound close with the careful sutures of public truth, and when people applauded she heard it as the sound of a door opening, not a gavel falling. After the dust settled, the consequences on screen were clean and human. The investor was fined and banned from buying more village plots, Taupe faced community restitution and public censure, and Chief Adeyemi used his power to rebuy the contested portion of Baba Musa's land and place it into a community trust that would fund school fees for the children of the market. Amina, who had refused to weaponize the billionaire's aid for revenge, received instead a scholarship fund that allowed her to complete her teaching certificate and a small grant to start evening classes in the market for women who had been cheated out of their wages. The contrast between old and new life was vivid. The compound where her father had once slammed the gate now had hands rebuilding a porch with laughter and mortar, the red earth after the rain compacted into a new path leading to a classroom instead of a closed door, and the black SUVs of achievement idled respectfully in the distance rather than running over souls. Baba Musa learned to sit in the courtyard and listen, and Amina, standing barefoot on the repaired threshold, felt her heart loose from the knot of yesterday. The new normal was tender and concrete. Amina taught in a classroom warmed by the sound of children reciting letters. The generator hummed not as a backdrop for struggle but as a steady pulse that powered laptops funded by the chief's education initiative, and the market stalls rang with fair prices because Amina's evening classes taught bookkeeping and dignity to the women who had once been silent. The billionaire did not become a spectacle of entitlement. Chief Adeyemi met the town on the steps of the mosque and broke yams at harvest, preferring to be known for his listening as much as his checks. Baba Musa, stripped of arrogance and repaired by remorse and community service, learned to greet his daughter with a quiet apology and a hand that no longer trembled with the urge to protect pride over people. The wealth gap remained visible, the gleam of a newly painted sign in the compound, the hum of a now stable generator versus the Danfo horns on the highway, but the line between who had and who had not was softened by institutions that would keep others from falling the way Amina did. Kindness plants seeds that bloom when no one is watching. Truth, when spoken clearly, will unmake lies that have been stitched into families. And dignity, once chosen, becomes the currency that mends more than banknotes ever could. Amina's choice to hold to her values, even when offered the quick comfort of humiliation and revenge, turned a hidden billionaire into a partner for community healing rather than a tool for personal triumph. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments how you would have chosen in Amina's place, and if you'd like more folktales like this one, please subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you warm and ready. The interval beat had passed and the dawn air carried the town's breath like a single long note. Amina found herself standing at the edge of the market where banners were being hung for a ceremony she had not asked for but could not refuse. Chief Adeyemi had called the town to a meeting where he would publicly anchor the truth and fund the healing. The plain-cap observer who once watched the gate slam shut now stood behind her with a quiet confidence she did not yet trust. The stakes was suddenly not just a house and a certificate, but a future where every child might walk to a classroom instead of fearing a knock on the door. So she asked herself what kind of person she wanted to be when power, legal, quiet, distant, pushed at her shoulders. Then the first turn came with the long line of teachers and mothers, and even Baba Musa, who carried a fresh apology in his eyes. Adeyemi stepped forward and spoke in the mosque courtyard with a voice that could calm a market quarrel and ignite a plan at once, a community education trust that would remold the land into a school precinct and a bursary fund, with governance that included a seat for Amina, a woman who had learned to speak truth in a town that often mistook silence for virtue. Yet, his eyes did not glow only with generosity, they flickered with a warning that the old mouths could still swarm, and lawyers could still twist words. So, before the crowd could cheer, he named a deadline for all legal links to be rechecked and for a transparent ledger to be published in the market square. He asked Amina to stand not as a victim or beneficiary, but as a partner in a building that would outlive the rumor mills. Would she accept a role that would place her at the table where money and memory met, or would the old town's appetite for quick justice pull her toward a public charge that might end in another closed gate? The sea. Road answered with a murmur like rain on zinc roofs, and she stepped forward, her bare feet cool against the concrete, and said she would be the voice for the children who could not yet vote but deserved a future they could claim. The second turn came through the ledger, for the printed lines revealed a web of past schemes that even Adeyemi's fortune and the people's trust could not erase in a day, a taupe connection here, a signed promissory note there, a shadow stitched into a document that could have undone the township in a morning. Amina's breath caught, not in fear but in the realization that truth would require more than courage. It would demand nerve, patience, and the willingness to withstand the sting of old wounds reopened in broad daylight, which meant she would have to walk through a stream of whispers and questions that could poison a season's harvest, while the children needed to believe that honesty would win and that wealth could be a tool of repair rather than a weapon of humiliation. The interval's third clue arrived in the same breath, an offhand remark from a journalist who had waited to file his story until the ledger's pages were truly readable, and it was this, and not every whisper of wealth would be used to heal the gash. Some would still try to steer the river toward a private dam, and if that happened, the town would need a guardian and a plan stronger than a generous smile. The audience gasped as Adeyemi unfolded the map of parcels in dispute, the path of a revival corridor, and the names of the children whose scholarships would be funded first. Amina felt the old ache loosen its hold on her chest and turn into a pulse of responsibility. She could feel dignity widening into a neighborhood, could almost hear the creak of the rebuilt gate at night, could imagine how laughter would ripple through the compound where her mother once counted tomatoes. The school's chalk dust would settle on the hands of those who learned to dream again. But she also felt the creeping question of whether the town could hold a trust without regressing into a new kind of gatekeeping, whether wealth would be used to bring everyone to the table or to keep some seats empty for those who already owned the room. Then, a door opened into a quieter room where the real business began, and the sign-off on the documents would happen in 2 weeks, the ceremony would be broadcast to every danfo and every street corner, and a first tranche of funds would arrive with the next market harvest. In that room, Adeyemi pressed a palm to hers and said softly, almost as if to remind himself of his own secret, that the town's true wealth was its memory and its courage, and that his discovery of Amina's character was not a proof of his wealth's power, but a license for her to shape its use. The scent of rain on the tar outside returned as if to remind them that even the sunniest afternoon can hold a storm, and in that moment, when the crowd's murmur turned to a chorus of shared intent, a new question anchored itself in her heart: would the town keep faith with a plan that owed its frame to a hidden rich man's quiet conscience, or would it drift toward a headline that could scorch the bread of every mother who hoped for a good school for their child? By dusk, the plan had a name, and the name was not a brand, but a promise, the Amina Adeyemi Community Education Trust, a gift, and a responsibility that could outlive the gate's memory. And when the town's lamps flickered to life along the market stalls and the generator hummed as if consenting to an agreement, she looked at Tope's empty chair, and then at Baba Musa's steady hands and at Chief Adeyemi's patient gaze, and heard in the soft percussion of the rain on zinc rooftops the first lines of a future she could hold without letting go of the wounded past. But she also felt the creeping question of whether the town could hold a trust without regressing into a new kind of gatekeeping, whether wealth would be used to bring everyone to the table or to keep some seats empty for those who already owned the room. And as the crowd filed away, she turned toward the plain cap that had become a symbol of ordinary courage and found it lowered in a nod toward the man who had chosen not to be a hero in the story, but a witness in the right place at the right time. And in that mutual quiet, the unspoken contract formed, that the town would keep its new doors open not by bending to wealth, but by inviting the best of themselves to fill the rooms, and that the first class in the new school would be named for the stray dog who had warmed a hungry heart and the old seller who had never given up on a child's future. And that the next challenge, perhaps a new investor circling the edges, or a rival's attempt to rewrite the ledger, would be met with the same blend of truth, kindness, and stubborn hope that had carried Amina this far. Because the interval had not closed the tale, it had simply reset the frame for the next scene to begin, with a clear reminder that money can mend when guided by mercy, and that a girl who once stood at a gate could now open doors for a whole village. Until the last line of this beat lands with a heartbeat's weight on the next act, at the moment when the trust's work reaches a classroom full of listening children and a market crowd learns to trust again, and the screen fades to black, leaving one brittle thread of suspense dangling. Who else in the shadows might still want to steer the river, and will the town's new alliance endure the next test? 2 weeks later, dawn unrolled over the market like a fresh sheet, and the town gathered in the shade of the mosque steps to witness what the interval had promised but not yet delivered, a formal start to the trust that would hold the land, fund the school, and give Amina a seat at the table where money and memory meet, while the air carried the salt of the sea and the scent of rain-soaked dust. The plain-cap observer stood near the generator humming at the edge of the crowd, watching the children press their faces to the banners with those halves of fear and hunger that every mother recognizes as hope begging to be fed. First thing announced was the land's new owner, not as a single benefactor but as a collective right, a community education precinct, and the first line of the ledger would soon be hung in the market square for all to read, so every whisper could be answered with a figure, and every figure would be measured against the mouths of hungry students and the proud, cautious faces of those who once believed the gate could never open again. The ceremony's rhythm moved like a drumbeat through the crowd. Chief Adeyemi spoke with a calm that felt almost holy. We break the old gates not by argument, but by openness, and we write the future in public, so no shadow can sell us back to the past. And as he spoke, the wind snagged the banners and flung them outward, letting a chorus of children's voices rise in answer, a dozen voices braided into one fluent line. Amina stood at his side with a modest gown that caught the lamplight and veiled the tremor in her throat, because the town's healing was not a small miracle, but a long, patient process that required witnesses, records, and a continuous vow to walk in truth, even when the old rumor mill tried to grind again. The ledger, displayed on a wooden stand salvaged from the market's old stalls, cracked open to the first page, names of beneficiaries, dates of transfers, a schedule for the opening of the first night classes. The crowd pressed closer, not out of curiosity, but out of a shared sense that history had written them into a new chapter. Amina felt the bite of the old wound soften as she read the line that promised a bursary for every girl who would walk into a classroom with chalk dust on her hands, and a father's shame at her back no longer a whip, but a question, what work could you do when your mind learned to carry both pride and mercy? A series of short, practical dialogues broke the formal air into human pace. A boy asked, "Can we really learn here after we finish selling tomatoes?" And a teacher replied, "Yes, we will learn to count more than money." A mother whispered to her neighbor, "If the books are here, the children will come home with more than stories." And the truth of those lines carried forward like a river turning a bend. You walk toward justice, and justice will carry you. Yet the micro-cliff-hanging spark flickered as the crowd's murmurs swelled into a tide when a sharp-eyed councilwoman named Dola rose and demanded, "Where is the accountability for the legacy funds? How do we know the money won't simply remouth the same promises?" Her question met a hush that suggested a knife's edge between fear of old power and hope for new rules, and Adeyemi, though steady, nodded and invited the audience to inspect not just the ledger's front pages but the appendix of receipts and origin papers, the kind of documents that could strand a rumor in its own harbor or wash it clean with sunlight. The town leaned in, and the plain-cap man shifted his weight, a subtle signal that he would not let the new frame become a gilded cage, which sent a tremor through Taupe's reserved smile sitting somewhere near the back, for she knew the ledger would expose more than her own misdeeds. And in that moment, the interval thread braided itself with the present, a rival investor, fierce in his own quiet calculation and previously unseen in public. The same broker who had once tried to purchase the market's voice for a single contract, now stood with a broker's clipboard and asked for a private review, claiming the trust's framework left room for renegotiation. And as his words slid over the crowd like oily rain, the room's temperature dropped, the generator paused in a sigh, and Amina's pulse rose with a raw, childlike honesty she had learned to mask, as she would not stand for a second collection of lies, not when the children's future was being mapped in real time, not when she could see the door of the old gate swing open again if they allowed fear to redraw the lines. The crowd's gaze shifted toward the observer with the plain cap, the man who had once listened in the market's fray and now wore the posture of a witness rather than a participant. He raised his hand gently and spoke with a gravity that drew everyone closer. There is a new audit underway, and it will be transparent, public, and beyond recourse to anyone who wants to bend it, and trust will be a living thing, not a rumor's cradle. His words settled the room like rain on tin roofs, and the rival's face darkened as he realized the town's nerve had steadied into a spine of collective memory. No longer would they accept a single contract to silence the poor or a ledger whose ink dried in the shadow of a closed door. Turning point came mid-cheer, when a courier arrived with a sealed envelope addressed to Amina, thick with the weight of a folder and the scent of old money and old secrets. She broke the wax with a slow, careful motion and found a confidential addendum that named the founder of the trust, and not the benevolent figure in the public eye but a secondary partner whose quiet money had purchased the land years ago and who had intended his name to stay hidden until the town could prove it could steward power without becoming a predator. The addendum included a directive that this figure would remain a silent guardian, ready to fund expansion as long as governance passed a further external audit every 6 months, and it warned that any attempt to override the audit would trigger a public exposure that could topple the trust's fragile consensus. The revelation jolted Amina, but it did not topple her mission. If anything, it sharpened the truth she had learned in the street's heat and the market's gossip. The town's wealth was not simply money but the capacity to align a million small actions with a single, public purpose: education for every child who asked for a future beyond the gate, not as a favor but as a shared birthright. Crowd's energy shifted again, from tentative relief to cautious pride. Grandmother pressed a breadcrumb into Amina's palm and whispered, "We will steward this with our grandchildren in mind." Amina pressed back her own palm, not to accept the crumb but to accept the responsibility. She would sit on the new council, not as the hero of a single day, but as a steady hand through whatever storms the ledger's pages might conjure, even if a subtle tremor remained, because the town's memory was not only generous, it was vigilant. By dusk, the ceremony had dissolved into a living, breathing plan. 2 new schools would rise where the old warehouses stood. Night classes would run in shifts so every mother could attend after the day's market, and the girls who once listened from the edge of the crowd would see their names on scholarships that would carry them beyond the town's red earth into universities and cities they had only visited in stories. The first tranche of funds would be released in a public ceremony that included a reading of the ledger's entries aloud, to prove that no line could be erased by rumor or pride. The dog, honored by the community as a symbol of steadfast companionship, wagged his tail at Amina from where he lay beneath the podium's shade, and the old seller who had never given up on a child's future clapped with a gentleness that surprised even him, as if the world was finally listening to a chorus that had learned to sing with both hunger and mercy. Yet even as the light darkened into an amber glow and the tax of relief softened on shoulders that had grown stiff with fear, a final shadow pressed at the edge of the square, a quiet, almost casual whisper from a man who had once spoken for the market's late lounge buyers, a reminder that wealth's river often runs in 2 channels, one for rebuilding and one for ruling, and this whisper hinted at another set of papers, another promise, another door left ajar for someone who wished to press a different chord into the town's harmony. And though Adeyemi's eyes searched the crowd for a sign of such a threat, he found instead a collective breath, a shared sense that the town's future would be guarded not by a single guardian or a single check but by a chorus of open doors, so that the next test would find them ready to respond, together, publicly, with humility and resolve. So the interval's arc began to sketch a lasting frame rather than a line of conclusion. Amina, standing with her feet planted on the earth that had once felt like a sentence, accepted the seat at the Trust's council with a shy, clear voice that spoke not of victory but of guardianship, and she named the first program after the stray dog who had warmed a hungry heart and the old seller who had never given up on a child's future, so that memory itself would be a coin passed from palm to palm, across generations. The town learned to read the ledger aloud, to question and verify, to smile when the funds arrived and to hold their breath when whispers rose from the shadows, and in that breath, the audience could hear the next question forming like a new dawn: who else beyond the gate would try to steer the river, and would they find in this new open door a partner rather than a prey? The answer lay in the next moment's steps. The first official audit meeting announced, the second scholarship application reviewed, the third neighbor's testimony recorded, and the last line of this chapter left deliberately open, a hinge for the next season to swing wide again. The trust would endure only if the town kept building on truth, courage, and a shared bedrock of mercy, and if someone still waiting in the wings chose to step into the light as witness, not as ruler, then the screen might again fade to black and the audience would wait, breath held, for the next scene to begin.